Hi, friends. Welcome to episode 22 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years and counting, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own, or when appropriate, I cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. So we've had a ridiculous winter, and to add to the growing list of weather phenomenon experienced recently, we are having a bomb cyclone today for the entire lower peninsula of Michigan. If you are curious, a bomb cyclone, which occurs through the process of bombogenesis, that's a word, is basically a winter hurricane. So, bad hair day for everybody. We reached 44 miles per hour sustained winds, which you will probably hear in this recording. On the one hand, I do appreciate the wind because the puddles, which have accumulated for most of the recent thaw, will not ice over into skating rinks, but rather evaporate. And what has been interesting while driving on the road is you see people with both hands on the steering wheel. And you need to be careful when you open your door because the gusts will whip the door out of your hand and hit the car parked next to you, or take the storm door off if you're at your house and rip it off its hinges if your timing is bad. So you just have to be mindful not to park your car underneath a 100-year-old tree. And when last I checked, there's an electrical pole lying across the school parking lot driveway, which will make Monday very interesting. Mondays are always rough, but this Monday will be particularly so. Unlike classroom teachers who see their students every day, or perhaps every other day, my building has an ABCD rotation, and give or take weekends, I see my classes every 4 to 6 days. Today, the 6 classes I will teach, I haven't seen in 30 days, a full month. One polar vortex day of negative 34 wind chills, 2 separate ice days separated by a week apart, and finally, midwinter break. So I feel like I'm starting from scratch. They don't call us special teachers for nothing. I would like to begin today's episode by giving a shout out to Kristen and her fellow school librarians in Connecticut. Welcome to the community of school librarians, and thank you very much for now making this podcast bi-coastal. If my Bitly account is to be believed, my podcast has at least one listener in India, in Sweden, Germany, the Philippines, and Oman. I would like to extend an invitation to anyone who would like to send me an email at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. As much as I enjoy the Twitter exchanges, I am finding listener email to be much more enjoyable. Unlike tweets, emails provide me with a better appreciation of who you are, what your library assignment is like, and what topics interest you. Admittedly, I created this podcast for my own selfish reasons. However, increasingly, when I plan out the upcoming episodes and discussion topics, I do so with listeners in mind. So please include your address in your email, and I will be sure to send you one of my podcast stickers. While we're on the topic of community building, I had another great experience tapping the collective brain of the AASL discussion board this week. Over the midwinter break, which coincides with President's Day, I had the opportunity to visit a friend's library. I hope to interview her Sunday because what she's doing is something I've never seen before. She is bringing a dormant library back into circulation. It wasn't clear how long the room had ceased to serve as the school library, but my friend will be re-entering the entire collection into Destiny, as nothing from the former circulation software exists. I posed a question to the AASL community on Thursday, and very shortly after, and for the next 2 days, I received a total of 13 responses. These were helpful, sincere, and detailed suggestions, as indicative of the helpful and sincere and very detail-oriented librarians who took the time to send them. I didn't bother posting the question on Twitter because the feedback I received was so thorough, more than I would ever need to make an informed decision. I mention this experience for 2 reasons. If you haven't yet joined ALA and AASL, I strongly recommend you do. And while it shouldn't surprise me that our discussion board is a great resource given that it's comprised of school librarians, this is and should always be a sounding board when we need to address challenges related to our job. And now, the topic for today is Dr. Seuss. I'll be very upfront at the beginning of this episode. I'm going to be addressing some of the controversy over Dr. Seuss. This is a vast and much debated topic, the kind that doctoral theses and documentaries and entire books are dedicated. There are academics for whom studying Dr. Seuss has been their life's work, and I in no way wish to lead any listeners into thinking that this is some definitive study on Dr. Seuss. I will address how Dr. Seuss is taught in my library lessons and how I rationalized the decision to include Dr. Seuss in my collections despite what some of the academics and critics say. For many people outside of children's literature and librarianship, the first time the controversy around Seuss's work was brought to the attention of the general public was in 2017. The first scandal involved a school librarian who rejected a gift of Dr. Seuss books from the First Lady, Melania Trump. I'll attach a link in the show notes. The second, also in 2017, was regarding a mural which incorporated racially stereotyped images from Dr. Seuss's first book, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, of a Chinese character, which was replaced when prominent authors refused an invitation to the opening of this Dr. Seuss museum in Springfield, Massachusetts. I want permission to promote this part of my collection for this one lesson because it held such an important part of my own reading journey. I live in the house where I basically grew up. The bookshelves in our basement still hold many of the same books that my brother and my 2 sisters and I enjoyed as children, and these are dominated by copies of Dr. Seuss and the I Can Read series which followed. I can catch myself all week saying, "Yeah, but I know Dr. Seuss was flawed." In much the same way, I try to understand when my 92-year-old grandmother privately used a racial slur when speaking to me regarding a staff member at her assisted living. My grandmother was a child of the Great Depression, growing up in the Deep South, Piggott, Arkansas. And until that comment, I had never heard her utter a disparaging word about anyone, and I won't love her less because of it. I appreciate what Anne Neely, professor of children's literature at Vanderbilt University, said, quote, "Just as every author or illustrator is, I think Theodore Geisel was a product of his time." End quote. She continues, quote, "We should not judge Theodore Geisel by today's standards, but we must evaluate his books that we decide to share with children using today's standards. We cannot wallow in our own nostalgia when we make choices for the books we share with young children. There are simply too many outstanding books available." End quote. My nostalgia is why I choose to read Dr. Seuss, but not ultimately why those books are still in circulation in my libraries. When my youngest students tell me that they've read a book all by themselves, it is almost always a Dr. Seuss book or an I Can Read beginning reader. Generations of children around the world learned not only how to read, but to gain the necessary confidence to read more because of Dr. Seuss. Our Seuss books will remain on the shelf for any student who wishes to read them. I feel to require perfection from anyone whose art we wish to consume or to impart on the children in our lives is unreasonable. I appreciate that in an age of #MeToo, we are rethinking many individuals in the motion picture industry. We may rethink which television and movies we take in based on the revelations made in the news. This weekend, our family movie was Bohemian Rhapsody. I am very aware of the allegations against Bryan Singer, the now fired director. But I know I'm not alone in my decision to enjoy this movie, in spite of the controversial former director, and to contribute to the now $225 million in box office sales. Just as I don't feel I owe an apology for enjoying this movie this past weekend, I also don't feel obligated to abandon the entire Seuss collection. Are my students better served if these books are removed from the shelf? I don't think so. I don't ever think the solution is removing books from a collection. Am I intentionally downplaying our Seuss books? I am aware that Read Across America, which prominently featured The Cat in the Hat from 1997 to 2017, has quietly shifted its focus away from The Cat in the Hat to highlight diverse books, and I'll attach a link in the show notes. I will feature books in one visit out of 46 class visits made by our kindergarten and first graders. And then, if students select to pick books off that shelf, that's their prerogative. To be honest, very few Seuss books circulate during the year. Some teachers will check out a few copies for this next week, but given that there are so many other books from which to choose, this shelf is generally passed over. The other 45 visits my students will enjoy involve the rest of the collection. One study, which was published this month in the journal Research on Diversity in Youth Literature, I'll attach a link in the show notes, is titled The Cat is Out of the Bag: Orientalism, Anti-Blackness, and White Supremacy in Dr. Seuss's Children's Books by author Katie Ishizuka of the Conscious Kid Library and Ramon Stevens of the University of California, San Diego. And I wanted to highlight that these authors were quoted in a related article by Grace Wong Lynch, Is the Cat in the Hat Racist? And the author said, quote, Ishizuka and Stevens emphasize that they are not trying to ban Dr. Seuss. Says Stevens, quote, it's not about reading or not reading certain books. It's about raising awareness around the social and systemic bias that such books promote, end quote. As I said at the onset of this podcast episode, the wealth of research that has been done on Dr. Seuss and the complexity of his art, I did my best to include links to not only all the articles I referenced in this episode, but also some which I just found thoroughly engaging and didn't have the opportunity to include. I do want to shift gears right now and move on to how Dr. Seuss is included in my own collection. I found out about Dr. Seuss in a rather unexpected artistic expressions about a year ago during a trip to Chicago when we took our sons to see Hamilton. There is a Dr. Seuss gallery in the Water Tower Shopping Center, and as any librarian would, I spent some time walking through the gallery. And some pieces were distinctly Seuss, others bore similarities, and some which I would have never guessed were works of art by Seuss unless I was told, and these were his nudes, the nudes that he did during his lifetime. And I wonder how many well-intentioned parents saw the enormous 10-foot tall cat in the hat which frames the entrance of the gallery and decided to take their very small and unsuspecting children in for a look. With regards to this art, said Maurice Sendak in an intro to a book published in 1995, 4 years after Dr. Seuss's death, titled The Secret Art of Dr. Seuss, quote, the Ted Geisel I knew was that rare amalgamation of genial gent and tomcat, a creature content with himself as an animal and artist, and one who didn't give a lick or spit for anyone's opinion one way or another of his work. He was, of course, immensely charming and polite about the whole matter, but when Ted fixed you with his calm cat gaze, you knew when to shut up. And it was easy to respect the simple honesty and curious privacy behind the gentle bluster of a man. But Seuss's apparent lack of interest in style, fashion, or any kind of analysis relating to his work astonished me. Only after years of friendship was I completely won over. Dr. Seuss was serious about not being serious. End quote. I will share how I teach Dr. Seuss each year. I've included links to my activities. Please feel free to use my worksheets. I am not on Teacher Pay Teacher, and I'm not as careful as I should be with the images that I pull from the internet. I reserve one lesson of the 46 visits to the library with my kindergartners and my first graders to have a story time and a table activity about Dr. Seuss. I always have a Dr. Seuss image on my smartboard when the students arrive. I inform the teachers that we're doing a Dr. Seuss lesson, and what is really interesting is what the teachers say in response. Increasingly, teachers tell me they don't do anything in the classroom Seuss-themed, and the explanation is sometimes something like this. They say, "What's the point? The kids have all those books at home, and they've read them all." I completely understand this rationale because when I do a story time, nothing is more bothersome than the chorus of children saying, "I have that book at home. Mrs. Herman, I have that book at home." Now, some teachers are counting on me to have a Seuss story time. I've taught their classes in the past, and they're always appreciative. And they'll say something like, "Oh, good, Amy, thanks. I'm so busy. I don't have time." The reason I've never been given is, don't you know Seuss was racist? So, I do continue to have a story time with my kindergartners and my first graders. And in both of my story times, I give them a little bit of background on Dr. Seuss, and I tell them exactly why I picked the stories I did. For kindergarten, I've read the other stories in the book called The Sneeches. And the other stories include Too Many Daves and What Was I Scared Of? Most students are expecting me to read the title story, and they have no idea of the other stories in the back of the book. Too Many Daves is fun because it is so short. The students are all surprised when it ends so abruptly, and the following debate ensues. Can a story that's only 3 pages long really be a story? And then I tell my students that the next story is the scariest story in the entire library. This is mostly true. I was terrified when my mother read this story, and the students are absolutely captivated. The story is called What Was I Scared Of? And it is in the back of the Sneeches book. And it is the story of a character who meets some pale green pants floating in the air. And if you've never read it before, please stop and read it right now, because it is a wonderful story. And if you ever have had a story time when you can tell every single student is hanging on every single word, I guarantee you this is one of those stories. The discussion that follows this story is so meaningful. We make a connection with perhaps new students in our classroom. Who should we be afraid of? Should we be afraid of the new student? The new student may be afraid of them. And as an adult, the pale green pants, the unknown that is out there, is an allegory for any fear we face. Students will spend 10 minutes practicing their handwriting at the tables and conclude with a checkout. I like to incorporate handwriting exercises into my library lessons. I have been very surprised to see how many ways my little students grasp their pencil and how varied they are in forming their letters. Thinking back, I would have never questioned how letters are supposed to be formed. I myself am left-handed, and I have very strong memories of teachers leaving me to my own devices to figure out how to grasp a pencil and angle my paper. I love connecting with my left-handed students, and I can work with them hand over hand. I can also work hand over hand with right-handed students, and I must be old school because I am still convinced there's only one way to grasp a pencil, and especially if you want to learn cursive. Should a librarian be teaching handwriting? My job is to get my students ready for next year, and that doesn't just include reading or research skills or digital literacy. It also includes learning how to write legibly and including your first and your last name on your paper, because once we hit spring, I start referring to my first graders as my almost second graders, my fourth graders as my almost fifth graders, and my fifth graders as graduating seniors. My first graders' story time can be found in the other stories in the Yertle the Turtle book, and this is the story of Gertrude McFuzz. I really like this story, especially if there's a chance my students will or have seen the Seussical musical. It's a wonderful musical, and the story of Gertrude fares prominently and has a very, very fun dance scene. And it isn't hard for my first graders to pull the important lesson we learned from Gertrude McFuzz. They share how we should be happy with who we are. We shouldn't try to be like somebody else. They also have a handwriting page and a checkout. During checkout, I will play a YouTube playlist by an artist called Vansmo. I'll attach a link in the show notes. And this playlist has 39 Dr. Seuss books, which are, the words are sung to ukulele playing and singing. I know I could have the same memorable conversations with my students while reading books other than Dr. Seuss, but I love these stories, and I love performing them. And is there any hint of xenophobia or racism in the stories I've chosen? No, quite the contrary. These are sweet stories which can be understood and analyzed by 5- and 6-year-olds. Dr. Seuss will remain in my libraries and will always be available for anyone who wishes to borrow them. If you listened to my episode, Live Your Best Library, this past fall, you know that my belief is that school librarians are the square peg in the round hole. My podcast logo is a square within a circle. When I was a classroom teacher, I felt I could relate to everything directly because, as a teacher, it all applied to me. Whether it was the principal's newsletter, the testing calendar, a teacher survey, or my annual evaluation. As a school librarian, I became a teacher with an asterisk, a specials teacher. Some things pertained, many did not. Other agenda items had to be completely modified to apply to me. The other equally important explanation for why my logo uses shapes is that I am no artist, and the easiest way to avoid any issues of copyright and fair use is to make my own logo using Google Draw. That being said, if you take the time to email me at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com and include your snail mail address, I will be happy to send you a podcast sticker. I would like to thank you for listening today. The topic of our next episode will be one that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is traveling librarians. Now, even if you don't travel from library to library, I guarantee you there's still going to be helpful information in next week's episode. But if you do cover more than one library, like I have for the past 5 years, I think you'll find a lot to learn from this next episode. I hope you will tune in.